Diplomats expelled, borders closed. Those are just some of the measures 5 Arab countries have taken after cutting ties with Qatar. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the Gulf's diplomatic crisis. It was a decision that plunged the Gulf into crisis overnight. 5 Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Bahrain, and Yemen, have officially cut ties with Qatar. The nation that co-founded the Gulf Cooperation Council saw 3 of its fellow members turn their backs and even go a step further, expelling Qatar's diplomats and giving its nationals 2 weeks to leave. The reasons for shutting Qatar out, well, they say the Gulf state supports terrorism in the region. Now isolated in a hostile neighborhood, Qatar remains defiant. No apologies, no pleas for unity, or calls for negotiations. Instead, Qatar is calling the decisions unjustified and baseless. So will this diplomatic split lead to further fracturing of the GCC? And who stands to gain from the rift? Yvette McCullough explains what's at stake.
Cut off by its once close allies, surrounded by an unprecedented isolation, and a sharp escalation of a simmering rift. On Monday, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, Libya's eastern-based government, and the Maldives all severed diplomatic ties with Qatar, accusing Doha of supporting terrorism and meddling in their domestic affairs, something Qatar denies. Saudi, Bahrain and the UAE gave all Qatari visitors and residents 2 weeks to leave, and the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen pulled out all Qatari soldiers. But this severing goes further than just diplomacy.
The government of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has decided to cut all land, air and sea contacts with Qatar and to prevent the passage of land, airspace and territorial waters.
The UAE, Bahrain and Egypt followed suit. It's expected to cause travel disruptions, as Doha is a major international travel hub. And as it's dependent on imported food, many Qataris have been scrambling to stock up on supplies. Qatar says these actions are completely unjustified and based on false claims and assumptions. The move to sever ties comes after a media fallout. Last month, Qatar media reported statements by Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani speaking out against Saudi Arabia and giving support to Iran. But according to Qatar, the comments weren't true and were the result of a cyber hack. But the damage, it appears, was already done. Broader grievances over geopolitics, the place of Islam in governance, and relations with Iran have been building between Qatar and its regional allies for years. But the fallout has never been this severe. This crisis puts other allies in a difficult position, and they've been calling for reconciliation.
We certainly would encourage the parties to sit down together and address these differences. We think it is important that the GCC remain unified.
Countries may of course have some issues and different ideas, but dialogue must continue under every circumstance for existing problems to be resolved peacefully.
Kuwait is trying to mediate the crisis, and Qatar's foreign minister says he is ready and willing to talk. But it's unclear whether Saudi Arabia and the others will also be willing to come to the table. How deep will this rift with Qatar go? And what will the continued fallout mean for the balance of power in the region? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Borzo Daragahi. He is a Middle East correspondent for BuzzFeed News. In London, Ian Black, a senior fellow at the Middle East Center, London School of Economics, and from Dubai, Obay Shabandar. He is an international security fellow at the New America Foundation. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let me just begin by asking your theories on why this has happened and why so fast. Borzo, let me start with you.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a mystery. We don't know why this happened at this moment, but I wouldn't say it's been fast. I'd say that this has been building for years now, this tension between Qatar on the one hand and Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the other. One theory is that this is because of Trump, because Donald Trump visited Saudi Arabia. They got along very well with the U.S. president, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and they felt emboldened to take this move. But that was still even a few weeks ago. The timing of it, as to why this very moment, what precipitated it, no one is quite sure.
I want to follow up with that theory in a second. But first, Ian, let me ask you, what's your consensus here?
Well, I go for the Trump theory. I mean, I agree with Borzu. The factors in the background have been around for a very long time. There was a crisis not quite as serious as this back in 2014, with a lot of the same issues. The Saudis, the Emiratis, angry at Qatar over the same kind of things: Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, Syria, Libya, extremism, all that stuff. But I think that the factor that has made a difference is the Donald Trump presidency. I think that they have been indeed emboldened. They think they've got the presidency here. And if you see what the president has been tweeting today on this, I think they're right. So that's my explanation. There are other factors, but I think in the immediate foreground, it's down to Donald.
Okay, Obai, Iran has actually said the same thing. The line out of Iran is really that this is a deliberate U.S. effort to foment further division between Arab countries. Do you see that as the case?
No, I do not see that as the case. I mean, if you're listening to what regional media outlets and experts are saying here in the Arabian Gulf region, is that the primary reason that the Arab coalition of the Gulf cooperation countries decided to isolate Qatar was that they believed that the Qatari government had reneged on an agreement that was signed in 2014 by Doha and the Arab allies that committed the Qatari government to not interfere in the internal affairs of other Arab countries in the region and the Arab alliance. And it seems that the leadership of the Gulf cooperation countries, led by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, had reached a point where they decided that the Qatari government was not meeting its agreement that it signed in 2014. Now, there are many factors here, and I think that President Trump's visit was a factor, but let's not forget that it wasn't just the President Trump meeting in the Riyadh during the Riyadh summit. During the second day of President Trump's visit to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there was a coalition of countries led by the Kingdom and the Gulf cooperation countries that signed what was called the Riyadh Declaration, which essentially put the interference led by the Iranian government and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in the region on par as a security threat with the extremist groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda. And it seems that the Gulf cooperation countries and the Arab coalition believe that the Qatari government is not fully in step with efforts to isolate malign activity by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in the region. So there are, I think, multiple causalities here at play. It wasn't just President Trump's meeting in Riyadh, and it seems the onus here is being put on the Qatari government for not following on upon the promises that it made to the rest of the Arab alliance in the region, and hence we are seeing the events today.
Let me ask you, I mean, is it interference, or has Qatar just decided to foster different relationships from what the Saudis would prefer because it serves their interest better? I mean, let's not forget that Qatar and Iran together share one of the biggest gas fields in the world. They need to get along.
Well, it's not a matter of normal diplomatic relationships with Iran. Every single Arab country in the Gulf cooperation area does have normalized relations with Iran. They have embassies in Tehran. That's not the issue here. What is at issue here is accusations by the Arab coalition that the Qatari, that representatives of the Qatari government were opening up lines of communication and potential cooperation with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Qasem Soleimani. And that's wholly separate than normalized diplomatic bilateral relations. And the reality is that when it comes to the Middle East, Iran's foreign policy is not led by its Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the normal diplomatic channel, but it is actually truly led by a secondary channels led by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, which, as we know, sponsor a variety of Shia militia extremists throughout the region, which the Arab coalition view as a direct security threat to the region.
Okay.
And the fact that Qatar is being accused of actively abetting with that level of Iranian activity, I think, is what was a major driver to lead to its isolation today.
Okay, Ian, it seemed you had a comment, and if you could perhaps explain how Qatar can then have it both ways. If it wants to serve cynical Iranian interests in the eyes of Saudi, how is it also helping Saudi on the border with Yemen, defending forces there?
Well, of course, one of the dramatic elements of the story that has happened over the last 24 hours is that the Qatari contingent in the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen has been removed. So they've been thrown out of that. But you're right. I mean, it's a fascinating feature of both of Qatar and the wider issue that Doha manages to pursue policies which appear to be mutually contradictory, but actually sit quite well together. We all know that Qatar is home to the largest American air base in the Middle East, Al Udeid. It also has quite cordial relations with Iran. It's full of contradictions. It's a country which I think the problem for its neighbors is that it acts independently, it punches above its weight. It is, of course, enormously wealthy, but it's a very, very small country. And it is, above all, independent and has been independent of the wishes of these powerful neighbors, the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular. But that doesn't mean that it isn't full of contradictions. It's also true that in the midst of this crisis, which is now attracting so much attention, if the reports are correct, the Qataris actually have been quietly getting rid of people from Hamas, the Palestinian Islamist movement, who have been based in Doha, to the annoyance of the Americans, the Israelis. They've actually done things that are in line with the demands being made of them. So, as they did also, incidentally, in the last crisis in 2014, where they closed down the Al Jazeera channel, Mubashir Masr, which was the source of enormous anger in Cairo. So they do respond to pressure at the same time as maintaining their ostensible independence. The question now is whether they can respond in the same way without completely folding up and losing face. But they've always been independent, and they've always done things which on the face of it are quite contradictory and keep their options open.
And they are under a lot of pressure, and they've been defiant. Borzu, let me ask you, do you think Qatar right now, especially given the fact that its only land border is now closed, can it afford to go rogue?
I mean, I think it probably can afford to go rogue, given the sea channels that it still has access to, given the fact that it maintains good relations not just with Iran, which already has offered to export foodstuffs to Qatar, but also with Kuwait and Oman. That is kind of interesting. Kuwait and especially Oman also have good relations with Iran. So I don't think that Iran is the issue here. And let's not forget that the UAE, especially Dubai, has enormously strong relations with Iran in terms of air connections, in terms of commercial ties. I think the issue, as Ian rightly pointed out, is a certain independent-minded foreign policy that really rankles Saudi Arabia. The question is, will they buckle? Will they pursue an independent course? And I think that that is one of the issues that will really be a big factor here, because if the UAE and Saudi Arabia made this huge gamble, and if they lose, that will be a big blow to them. And let's just be honest, recent years, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, with these kind of schemes, they have not had a good record. They've failed in Syria. They're flailing in Yemen. They were not able to stop the Iran nuclear agreement, despite all the money they spent lobbying Washington and so on. So I'm skeptical that this will succeed just based on the track record. It could open up an opportunity for Turkey, which has already committed to a security partnership with Qatar. It could open up an opportunity for Russia, which has been pining for warm water ports and access for centuries, and it could open up an opportunity for Iran.
And I want to go back to the theory I said I'd return to, the one that you brought up about, is Saudi feeling very emboldened by Trump's visit to the Middle East? And we have some of the tweets that Trump has put out saying basically hooray for Saudi in this move to isolate Qatar. Do you think, though, if Saudi does indeed feel emboldened by Trump's support, are they risking something here? Can that support actually backfire?
I think it could backfire. I think there is a risk there. And by the way, we're not sure who's driving this policy because, honestly, Saudi Arabia is kind of okay with the Muslim Brotherhood that Qatar has been hosting. I think really it's the UAE that's been driving this. And it's basically, I get this image of a bunch of people sitting in a conference room with PowerPoint presentations trying to bring down the Qatari government. This kind of plan never succeeds in the Middle East.
Obai, I just want to get your response to what Borzo's had to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to look at the months leading up to this current crisis. Both the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the leadership of UAE had bilateral visits with the Emir of Qatar, Emir Tamim, in the prior months. There was a concerted effort to bring Qatar back into the fold of the Arab coalition and the GCC, the Gulf cooperation countries. And ever since 2014, there's been an active effort to bring Qatar as an equitable member of the Arab alliance. And so when you speak to folks here in the region, they will tell you that they feel betrayed, that despite the effort by the king in Saudi Arabia and the crown prince in Abu Dhabi to improve relations with Qatar, they will tell you that Qatar bit the hand that fed them. So as we have a saying, we have an American saying that the chickens come home to roost, and it seems eventually that the leadership of the Arab coalition, both in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, have had just about enough with the intransigence of the Qatari government. Now, whether or not Doha can survive this, in 2014, the Arab alliance merely withdrew their ambassadors and returned them after 1 month when the Doha government agreed to a set of demands. This time around, it's much more serious. We're already seeing economic indications that Doha is taking a major hit due to the embargo, the land and air embargo. They can only, in my estimation, they can't sustain this for long, especially in terms of their ability to maintain internal cohesion and domestic cohesion in Qatar. And it seems at this time that the Emir of Qatar may be doing his people a grave disservice by not reconciling with the Arab coalition.
When has this kind of pressure ever worked? When has this kind of plot, when has it worked? Has it worked with Iran? Has it worked with Cuba? Why would it work with Qatar, which has a lot more money, a lot more diplomatic connections, a lot more savvy? And I mean, if you saw the responses from the Qatari leadership, it was wounded pride. These guys are, you know, they're not about to just sort of buckle and give in to demands that would be rather humiliating. Is that really the way it works in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, in the Gulf, that you humiliate someone into submission? Does that ever work?
Okay. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to give each of you a chance to respond to this. How do you foresee this, if you do foresee this, being resolved? Ian, go ahead.
We've seen already today the Emir of Kuwait. Kuwait is interesting. I think Borzo mentioned this. Kuwait is not part of this. It hasn't taken any measures against the Qataris. It's maintained its independence, as have the Omanis. The Emir of Kuwait looks likely to me. I think the Tamim, the Emir of Qatar, has gone there, or they're meeting in any event. And I think that you will see an attempt to try to diffuse this by people who are in the GCC, but not the main players. The Omanis we've heard less of. It's important also to point out, of course, the Omanis, I think somebody said, have very good relations with the Iranians. The issue, to my mind, by the way, is not only about the Iranians. It's much more about political Islam. That is the issue, especially for the Emiratis, who are obsessed by the Muslim Brotherhood to the exclusion of all else. That is the sin of the Qataris, certainly in Emirati eyes. And I think that the Kuwaitis will try hard to see if they can at least calm things down for the moment, to at least avoid this escalating any further.
Obai?
Look, the leaders of the Arab coalition have publicly stated today that they are looking for a framework of guarantees from Qatar if they are to bring Doha back into the fold and to end Qatar's isolation. I think the leaders of the GCC in Saudi Arabia and UAE and Bahrain and others are going to look for serious, solid guarantees from Qatar to rectify what they view has been extreme intransigence, from supporting extremist groups to interference in internal affairs. And until then, I think that the Qatari government is going to find itself in an extremely dire position.
Okay, Borzu, final word.
I mean, I'm just sort of fascinated by the new generation of Gulf leadership rising up and just taking these bold measures that were unprecedented before. And I think that is really what you're seeing. You're seeing a generational shift, a new attitude, a certain kind of recklessness, I might say. And it would be great if you had influential Western leaders who could come here and kind of provide some wisdom. But it seems like we have the opposite right now. We have a U.S. president that's actually throwing fuel on the fire with his tweets encouraging the Saudis to triple down, so to speak, and the Emiratis to triple down on this pressure on Qatar, explicitly taking the taking the Saudi UAE position on this very vocally, very publicly, basically pulling himself out of playing a mediating role that the U.S. could be playing.
Okay, Borzu, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. All this week, we're bringing you special coverage of the UK's snap election. Today, we look at Scotland, a crucial part of that vote that could shape the future of the UK itself. In 2014, the Scottish people gave a resounding no to the prospect of seceding from the United Kingdom. But a lot has happened in the 3 years since that vote, from Brexit to the election of US President Donald Trump and a wave of terrorist attacks. With anxiety growing over the UK's pending divorce with the EU, are the Scottish people starting to hedge their bets? And how will that uncertainty influence whom they vote for on June the 8th? Randolph Nogle tells us more.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon says she wants a seat at the Brexit negotiation table. Well, given that she wants Scotland to leave the UK and she wants Scotland to be in the EU, you have to ask which side of the negotiation table does she want to be on?
After 20 years of political isolation in Scotland, the Conservatives could be making a comeback. And while there are 700,000 Scots who voted to leave the European Union a year ago, Brexit has not been the Conservatives' biggest selling point to attract new supporters.
Well, the main issue on the doorsteps is the prospect of another referendum, and that undoubtedly is the biggest issue which is mentioned by most voters.
John Lamont is one of the Scottish Conservatives in contention. He's well known in the area. He was the local representative in Scottish Parliament for 10 years. He resigned ahead of this election, a show of confidence that he thinks he can win the Westminster seat for the Conservatives in what looks to be a tight race.
There is a trend and a mood of voters moving towards the Conservative Party because they see Ruth Davidson and Scottish Conservatives as the best and most effective way of sending a message to Nicola Sturgeon that they don't want another referendum.
The Ettrick-Roxburgh-Berwickshire constituency is a borderland with England.
Because there's a lot of English people, I think, actually live here in the borders, and then they tend to automatically vote Conservative, Tory.
David McNeil runs a general store in the area. He says the SNP are the only party fit to represent Scots because of their pro-independence agenda.
I mean, who can run this country better than ourselves? Certainly not people 400 miles away in another country, in London, who are completely out of touch with this Scottish psyche. We feel as if it's just been traded away. London couldn't care less about us because nobody in Scotland really votes Conservative.
The SNP are not Scotland. The SNP do not have a monopoly of being Scottish. I am as Scottish as anybody else, and it is a complete myth for the SNP to try and pretend that they are the only people who can stand up for Scotland at Westminster.
David says he's supporting Lamont's SNP opponent, incumbent Callum Kerr.
He is as Scottish as anybody, fair enough, but his political ideals are just completely out of kilter. Our ideals are for Scotland. His ideals are for his masters down in England, down in London. So he's a nice guy, but I mean, Callum Kerr's a nicer guy.
David is taking part in a march in Glasgow for independence, something the SNP have not been as vocal about this election.
Vote SNP on the 8th of June to give me a mandate to demand a place for Scotland at the Brexit negotiating table so we can work to keep Scotland in the single market.
While the Conservatives have used the debate over independence to try to pick up votes, the SNP has talked more about Brexit on the campaign trail. The SNP has said that only after ink on the Brexit negotiations has dried can Scotland resume its push for independence. Asad Khan was one of the youth behind the initial push.
Over 80% of young people voted, and I was one of the 16 and 17-year-olds again that were able to vote in the referendum. So it was great, no, definitely. This election is not about independence. This election is about SNP, whether or not we want to stop the Tories.
He says the fact that the SNP are not talking about independence during this election doesn't mean there isn't hope.
Well, we can't quite come to terms with how we, as Scotland, aren't getting the government that we vote for. We saw, I think it was since 1955, Scotland has consistently voted against the Tory government, and it's been Labour until 2015. But yet we've had Tory governments. That's just not fair.
The SNP has replaced Labour as the party representing Scots' left-leaning electorate.
I was a Labour voter for 35 years, but Labour have let Scotland down so badly. I support Jeremy Corbyn, but the leaders in Scotland are out campaigning now for the Tories to stop SNP. They should be stopping the Tories, not supporting them.
While some say that Tory gains will strike a blow against independence, it's clear here that there's still plenty of energy left in the movement. The SNP is widely expected to remain the dominant party, and while their majority may be trimmed and their agenda delayed, it's clear that many Scots will continue to push for an independent Scotland, whatever the result. Randolph Nogle, the Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now by James Dornan. He is the Scottish National Party Member of Parliament for Glasgow Cathcart. From Edinburgh, John McClellan. He is the Conservative Councillor for the City of Edinburgh and Director of the Scottish Newspapers Society. Also from Edinburgh, Eric Joyce. He is a former Labour Member of Parliament. Thanks all so much for joining us. You know, I've just cast my mind back to when Theresa May actually said she would not call a general election, only to change her mind last month and say she needs a stronger mandate to negotiate Brexit, and June 8th is the day. So I want to ask all three of you, where does that decision leave Scotland? Is a snap election good for the country? Eric Joyce, let me start with you.
Well, Theresa May has been exposed as wobbly and weak throughout this whole campaign. It's the most striking aspect of the whole general election campaign, many people think. As far as Scotland's concerned, it's really a secondary consideration of the UK government, which is entirely dominated by England. Almost every single minister is English. And Theresa May's consideration of Scotland really comes a long way down her list of priorities. So Scotland will go through with this, as we have to, but hopefully this may be for the last time.
Okay, John McClellan.
Well, I think it's an opportunity to give clarity to the whole political settlement across the whole of the UK. And I think that the Prime Minister's position has been to do what she thinks is best for the whole of the UK, and hopefully after Thursday we'll have the clarity that that the whole of the country needs, and in particular in Scotland.
Okay, James Dornan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's quite amusing that the one person who now wishes that there wasn't an election more than anybody else is probably Theresa May. She started off from a position where she thought she was just going to be able to have a procession until polling day, and it's not turned out like that. You can't hide from the public and then pretend that you're a strong leader, and that's what Theresa May's been doing. So this election shouldn't have been happening in the first place, happened for the wrong reasons, and now I think that she regrets calling it.
But James, I've actually heard some say that Theresa May and Brexit could actually prove the best thing to happen to the Scottish National Party.
In what way? I mean, this is Brexit. The decision to leave the European Union was the second worst political decision that I have had in my political career. obviously the first being the morning of the September the 19th in 2014. But it's not good for Scotland, it's not good for the rest of the UK, and it's particularly not good for Scotland if Scotland is going to have absolutely no say on what sort of deal that we're going to be left with. We need to be able to stay in the single market.
I think you misunderstood the point. Theresa May pushing for Brexit against the will of the Scottish people pushes support towards the Scottish National Party.
Well, maybe, but you know, sometimes we have to look at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is that this is going to be bad for the people of Scotland. That decision that they made and the way that she's running this Brexit campaign is bad for the people of Scotland, and it's bad for the United Kingdom. It may well end up that what it does is boost their support for the independence, or it boosts their support for the SNP. But to be honest, there's a bigger picture at stake here, and the fact is it's the way that the Brexit is going to impact on the people of Scotland.
Okay, John, let me ask you, do you feel that Theresa May has Scotland's best interest at heart?
Well, yes, I do. I don't think there's any question of that, but she's acting as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I think just to answer your previous point about whether the Brexit has been good for the SNP, I think even James would confess that actually it hasn't. It hasn't resulted in an increase in SNP support. And in fact, certainly I've picked up many people on the doorsteps who have it's caused them, SNP supporters who've been caused a significant problem about it because they want even less to do with Brussels than they want to do with London. 400,000 SNP members, it's estimated, do not want to be part of the EU. So it's posed a significant question for the SNP in the way that they manage this process. I'm sure James knows that because he'll have been speaking to these members too.
James, I'll let you respond.
There's also a lot of members, there's also a lot of supporters of the Union that supported Remain. So you can't have this as a one-sided thing. It's both sides of this debate that there's been a crossover.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that, James. I was a Remain campaigner myself, so you know, I'm not saying that this is a problem that is only for the SNP, but I just think it's to challenge the point raised by the interviewer that this has been good for the SNP, because I don't think it has.
Eric, let me ask you, how many people do you think actually share your sentiment that they voted against Scottish independence only to say now, we don't want the UK, we want the EU, and if Scottish independence is the way to get back into the EU, we'll move in that direction?
A lot. John earlier referred to SNP support. There's a difference between SNP support and support for independence. What's happened in Scotland is that the Conservatives have benefited from one or two people from the SNP moving across, perhaps towards their right, moving across to the Tories, and a lot of unionists, people who want to stay part of the UK, from the Labour Party moving across, and it's left a very large chunk of the admittedly modest support in Scotland within the Labour Party now supporting independence. So to whatever vote the SNP gets, perhaps 42, 43% of the vote, you need to add an additional 7 or 8% for people in the Labour Party who would prefer independence now, because they want to stay in the EU and they completely deplore the Brexit nonsense the Prime Minister is taking us through.
Eric, let me ask you though, do you think it's likely that Scotland could declare independence from the UK and ultimately rejoin the EU if a hard Brexit goes through?
I think it's actually likely, yes. I think at the moment the split looks to be about 50-50. But in due course, we're going to see many very, very bad effects of Brexit. This is exactly what people like John argued and said in the case when he campaigned for Remain. He said it would be bad to go through Brexit, and now we're going through Brexit. In the event that Scotland does, as I hope, vote for independence, it'll be up to Scotland to have its own referendum to decide whether it wants to remain in the EU or return to the EU. And I strongly feel that they will, but it's up to Scots to make their own judgment, as it is with every other EU member. And I think they will decide to go back into the EU.
And John, let me ask you, why don't you feel Scotland can do it on its own? Why isn't self-determination really good for the Scottish people?
The UK has benefited Scotland for many, many years and will continue to do so. Scotland faces a number of challenges which it's best able to meet with the support of the rest of the UK. We know that there's a small matter of £15 billion shortfall in the taxation position in Scotland, and if everything went the SNP's way in an independent Scotland, we'd still have to find £15 billion from somewhere. That's a hell of a bill to put before the Scottish people, and there's no matter which way you cut that, that would mean either slashes in services or increases in taxation, and there's no way around that. That is the position that an independent Scotland would face, and that's one very good reason why I'm firmly against it. The other thing is quite simply that people like me have never felt alienated from the systems that govern the United Kingdom. We are part of the United Kingdom. We are British as well as Scottish, and we want to remain so.
Eric, let me ask you, do you feel a sense of alienation at all?
What I think is that there's a broad centre-left consensus in Scotland, and there is a very strong right-wing consensus in England. And in the end, the politics of the UK now is all about the politics of England, telling everybody else the way it's going to be. It's really the UK has become a greater England. And people in Scotland who want a decent social democracy in the context of the EU have to make a choice. They can be part of a long-term conservative greater England, or they can be a small country in the EU. And the EU seems, to many of us, by far the larger and more important historical project.
James, I'll let you comment there, because I saw you kind of raise your eyebrows as John was speaking.
Yes. The 15 billion was raised again. What John forgets to mention is that the UK has got debt of what, £1.5 trillion. Debt is as usual in a country, and debt has to be paid for. But that would be a matter. That's just a matter of fact. Also, you've got to remember that this debt. Scotland is not an independent country just now, so the debt is the UK's, and this debt has been built up over the UK. It is not a Scottish debt.
John, if you want to respond quickly, go ahead, or else I'd like to wrap up with a final thought. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, what James is suggesting is that we just keep borrowing. A new country that will have no credit rating at all, borrowing at the maximum expense, so that the SNP's programme to cover our costs is just to keep on borrowing. It's a very straightforward programme for total bankruptcy of this country, and it's something which all sensible people would do
£1.5 trillion of debt sounds a wee bit like a big debt.
It will be even bigger per capita in an independent Scotland. I think that's fair.
Okay, I want to wrap up with a final issue here, because all three of you are on very different pages, and in a sense you do pretty well represent the Scottish public, which does seem politically divided now in a way it hadn't been before. Eric, Joyce, let me start with you. How much stronger a position would Scotland be in if it were more politically united going into this election?
Well, it's divided because we have different opinions, and we're a democracy, so we have to make a judgment. But I think the simple fact is that the trajectory of history is more about the kind of society we want to live in, and not about arguing about today's deficit, yesterday's deficit, what tomorrow's deficit might be. These are economic figures that people can juggle and throw all over the place. In the end, there's a large economic project in the EU, and there is a strong cultural and economic tie between Scotland and the EU. And many of us, I think over half of us in due course, will want to be part of that, and not part of this trend towards right-wing, little Ingleter, greater Ingleter, more like the US, red in tooth and claw, extreme conservatism. We don't want part of that.
John, go ahead.
It's not a conservatism that I recognise, that's for sure. I think the issue as far as the UK versus the EU, again, because it comes down to brass tacks. The UK is worth 4 times more to Scotland than the EU is. So what does Scotland want to be part of a single
market? Does everything boil down to money,
Kingdom,
John?
Or does it want to break that?
Does everything boil down to money?
It does not. Well, everything has to be paid for.
Sure, but you're making up a figure of 15 billion. That's a made-up figure. That's a made-up figure. It's a trope.
It's not a made-up figure. Those are from GERS. Those are from the GERS figures.
You know it's a trope.
That is not a made-up figure.
It's extracted from the UK figures.
It is from the GERS.
You know it's extracted from the UK figure, which doesn't explicitly refer to Scotland's economic output.
These are GERS figures that the Scottish Government goes along with. It's not.
And explicitly within JARS it says this is not a projection. As you know, it explicitly says in JARS that this is not
no, it's where we are now. It is where we are now. From
economy, independent.
We would be starting with a £15 billion.
It's a Tory trope.
No.
Okay, James Dornan, I'll let you jump in.
No, it's not. Yes, I was just going to leave the matter for the time being. Scotland, Eric's quite right. It's all about the sort of country that we want. And I think that there's more and more people who want to see the difference between the European movement and what's happening down south. Scotland has always been that left of centre, social democratic country in the main, and I think that that's where we would continue to want to be. And the more that they see what the UK is going to be like under a hard Brexit, the more that the people in Scotland are going to come to our project and try their hardest to distance themselves from the project that is going to be that greater England, as Eric described it, which the UK is going to become. And we're seeing it more and more. And you have to remember that we've got two Conservative leaders, Ruth Davidson and Theresa May, who both supported Remain and said that Brexit would be a disaster for us, and have suddenly changed their mind because that suits their career prospects as opposed to what's best for the country. And I think that's a pretty shameful position for them to be in.
Okay, unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave it there.
It suits the democratic outcome of the referendum.
I'm going to give you the last word, James, and a little bit to John there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us from Scotland on this edition of the Newsmakers. Now, while many developed countries are scrambling to provide jobs, Japan has too many, with vacancies across the board, from the highly skilled to the unskilled. Now, there's a lot of debate over what's actually causing the labor shortage. Everything from low birth rates to a conservative workforce that makes it difficult for women to balance careers and motherhood are said to be part of the problem. And with deaths having far outpaced births for several years now, Japan's population is declining. If the last 5 years are anything to go by, Japan is expected to shrink by 1 million people a year going forward. Now, this will mean fewer workers to support what is already the oldest population in the world. Now, how will Japan's government respond to this looming demographic crisis? Natalie Pohonen reports.
Japan's shifting demographics have long made headlines. Its people are aging, and there aren't enough babies being born to create the next generations of workers and taxpayers. And while the nation is at the forefront of robotics and animation, it still can't plug the shortfall in human resources. The country is home to 127 million people. That figure is expected to drop to 88 million by 2065. But Japan is already suffering from labour pains. There are now 1.48 jobs for every applicant, the strongest demand for workers in more than 40 years. The government has been promoting domestic solutions to the shortfall. It's been encouraging the corporate sector to change the jobs on offer from contracts and part-time positions to permanent roles, and urging better pay.
We are anticipating added value and higher quality work content for part-time employees as we increase their wages. Also, we are allowing both part-time and full-time employees to be able to take part in the same training for skill development.
It's even looking at ways to entice people, particularly mothers and the elderly, to return to the workforce. In February, Japan had its first Premium Friday to encourage employers to send their employees home a few hours earlier than usual. But one option which the government appears reluctant to look at is immigration. Foreigners make up about 2% of the population. About 50,000 immigrants come to Japan each year. Most of them are students or guest workers. Many foreigners from places such as China and Indonesia are often in low-paying and temporary jobs, like taking care of the elderly. But there is a reluctance amongst politicians and many citizens to make that a permanent remedy to the shrinking labour pool. The onus is on a Japanese answer to a Japanese problem. But for how much longer can the nation ignore a potential solution to its looming demographic crisis? Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Riley Walters. He's a Japan specialist and research associate at the Heritage Foundation. And also from Washington is Shihoko Goto. She is a senior Northeast Asia associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thanks both so much for joining us. Riley, let me start with you. Japan has a traditionally insular culture, so we actually shouldn't be very surprised if the country addresses this labor shortage by looking towards its domestic policy adjustment rather than looking abroad toward immigration. So let me get the consensus between both of you. Can Japan resolve this shortage without actually engaging in much larger scale immigration?
So they've certainly tried over the past few years. One way that Prime Minister Abe has attempted to address the issue is by relying more on robotics to sort of meet not only just manufacturing labor shortages, but also elderly care, different types of care such as children care, dementia, things like that.
Okay, Shihoko, do you think this can be done from inside, from readjusting Japan's domestic policy, or does Japan need to get more comfortable with the idea of immigration?
Well, let me address your second question first regarding immigration. If you look at the demographic situation, it is a ticking time bomb. Nearly 40% of the Japanese population will be over 65 years or more within the next 10, 15 years. That said, immigration hasn't really been a rallying cry either for legislators or from the general public. There is a lot of concern about the social issues that mass immigration will bring. That said, today there is a growing number of foreign workers in Japan, either under the table or by legal means as well. So there is a change. It may be rather glacial compared to Western standards, but at the same time there is a acceptance of foreign workers as well. But in order to address this huge situation, certainly immigration will have to be considered as one of the tools, but one of the many. As Riley said, robotics is one. And then the other one, of course, is to really make good use of women in the workforce. Women in Japan are highly educated, and yet they are underutilized.
I'd like to get to the issue about women in a second, but I want to hone in on something you said, which is the growing concern about social issues surrounding immigration. Talk to us a bit about that. What are the specific issues with Japan that prevents immigration from being a bigger part of the solution?
Well, Japan really sees itself as a nation of Japanese. This may or may not be correct ethnically. There are a lot of Japanese who are ethnically Chinese, ethnically Korean, and from other parts of Asia. That said, it is a relatively homogenous society, and the Japanese are very comfortable with it. They believe that the homogeneity has been a source of strength, not a source of weakness for economic growth. And they're very proud of the fact of, especially post-war, that they had this rapid rise in the economy. But the problem with that is that when Japan looks to other countries, especially the United States and Europe, a lot of the problems that Japan sees in these two societies are often seen as a result of immigration policies, rightly or wrongly.
Okay, Riley, let me see if you're on the same page here. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what your personal experience in Japan is, but do you see certain cultural peculiarities about Japan hindering its progress in addressing this problem because there is this reluctance toward immigration?
I wouldn't say so. I would say first that you already do have sort of a change in Japanese identity with the shrinking population, more migration toward urban areas from rural areas. So you've already got this sort of decrease in rural Japanese culture. The addition of migrant workers, immigration, things like that. Yes, Japan has traditionally sort of waned off immigration, and to a certain degree in the future, Japanese politicians might even be willing to risk a certain level of growth to keep Japanese immigration to a certain level. Now, for growth, obviously, immigration is key, and some of the officials have been looking toward increased immigration. And I think there is room for growth, personally. My own experience, I've lived in both rural and urban Japan. And I think there is sort of this delineage between what is Japanese and what is foreign. But I think there's definitely room for better integration of both, just sort of expanding upon Japanese culture amongst the immigration population.
Okay, Shihoko, I want to get back to you and if you can, address what you were alluding to about the issue with women in the Japanese workforce. There are traditional complexes at play here. Speak to us about what Japan is really up against, trying to better integrate women into the workforce and to fill these jobs.
Right. There's two fundamental issues. One is gender bias, that this is still very much a male-dominated society. And then secondly, there are practices within the workforce that are not conducive to balancing work and family commitments. Regarding the first one about gender bias, one of the achievements of the current Abe administration is to highlight the fact that women can be a source of strength for Japan. There is this phrase called womenomics that really has tried to elevate this, and there have been a number of numerical targets laid out by the Japanese government. Many blue chip companies have adopted numerical targets to increase women in the executive positions. There is a recognition that it is a problem, that women are not reaching their full potential, and there is encouragement from both the public and the private sector to have more women in the workforce.
I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us. Shihoko Goto there as well from Washington. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Next time, we ask whether one of Italy's most ruthless mafia bosses should be freed from prison. Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.